It began not with a roar, but with a whisper in a quiet room. Catherine Vale, a woman whose smile had once been a familiar fixture on television screens across the country, sat staring at a blank document on her laptop. The cursor blinked back at her, a steady, mocking metronome. Outside her window, the world moved on. Cars passed, people walked their dogs. Life in its ordinary glory continued unabated. But inside, Catherine was trapped in the silent, lonely aftermath of a war her body had fought. She had survived. The scans were clear, the doctors were pleased, and the word remission had been spoken with celebratory smiles. Yet, as she placed a trembling hand on the keyboard, she realized the hardest part was only just beginning. How do you explain that the fight leaves scars no one can see? How do you describe the haunting quiet when the constant barrage of appointments and treatments ends, and you're left alone with the echoes of fear? She took a deep breath, her first shaky words of confession, not of strength, but of profound confusion. "Everyone keeps telling me I should be happy," she typed. "So why do I feel so lost?" She had no idea that this fragile question, sent out into the vast digital night, will become a lighthouse for millions drowning in the same unseen storm. The journey to that moment was carved in months of unspoken terror. Catherine's life before cancer was a vibrant tapestry of deadlines, live broadcasts, red carpets, and the exhilarating chaos of a rising career in journalism. She was the one asking the questions, crafting the narratives, making sense of the world for her audience. Then, a routine checkup, a doctor's too long silence, and a single word, malignant, unraveled it all. Overnight, she became the subject of the story. The fierce, independent woman was reduced to a patient in a paper gown, vulnerable to needles, toxins, and statistics. Chemotherapy was a brutal siege. It stole her hair, her energy, the familiar contours of her face. But more insidiously, it stole her voice. Reporters who once sought her opinions now wrote sympathetic pieces about her brave battle. Friends spoke in hushed, pitying tones. She became Catherine with cancer, her identity subsumed by the disease. Through the worst of it, she maintained a public facade. On the rare occasions she posted on social media, it was a carefully curated image, a bright headscarf, a thumbs up from the hospital bed, a caption about staying positive. Her fans cheered her strength. But the truth was a midnight creature, gnawing at her in the dark. The truth was the cold fear that slithered down her spine before every scan. The truth was the alienation she felt when well-meaning people said, "You've got this," as if willpower alone could command rogue cells. She felt like a fraud, performing wellness for the world while inside she was shattered. The end of active treatment brought not jubilation, but a terrifying void. The battle had given her a terrible purpose. Survival left her adrift. The hospital, with its clear rhythms and caring nurses, was a strange kind of comfort. Home, expected to be a haven, felt alien. Her body was a landscape of changes, new scars, unfamiliar aches, a fragility that startled her. The pressure to be grateful and return to normal was a weight heavier than any she had carried during treatment. One rainy afternoon, scrolling through endless posts of others' seemingly perfect lives, she saw yet another comment on an old photo of hers. So inspiring. "You beat it. Now go live your best life." A wave of sudden, sharp anger surprised her. It wasn't the commenters' fault. They meant well. But the gulf between their perception and her reality felt like a chasm she could fall into forever. That was the moment the whisper started. What if she stopped performing? What if she told the raw, unvarnished truth? Not for sympathy, but for the simple, terrifying act of being real. The idea terrified her. It would mean exposing the cracks, admitting to the fear that still lived in her bones, risking the inspiration label she'd been given. But the loneliness of pretending was becoming unbearable. So, that evening, she opened the laptop. She ignored the templates for triumphant, "I beat cancer" posts. Instead, she started writing from the bruised, quiet place within. She wrote about the fear of recurrence that was her first thought every morning. She wrote about looking in the mirror and not recognizing the woman who looked back. She wrote about the awkwardness of social interactions, the friends who had faded away, the strange grief for the person she was before. She wrote about the paradox of surviving, but not feeling alive. For the first time in over a year, the words flowed without calculation, without a filter. They were messy, emotional, and utterly devastatingly honest. With a heartbeat of hesitation that seemed to last an eternity, she hit post. Then, she closed her laptop, walked away, and did not dare look at it for the rest of the night, half expecting, half fearing the reverberations of her truth. The sun rose, as it always does, but Catherine's world had irrevocably shifted in the night. She awoke with a knot of dread in her stomach, the memory of her raw, emotional post flooding back. It felt like she had sleepwalked to the edge of a cliff and stepped off. The instinct to delete it, to scramble back to the safety of the curated, positive facade, was almost overwhelming. She made a pot of tea, her hands unsteady, avoiding her phone as if it were a live wire. Finally, the anxiety won. She opened the app, bracing for silence, for confusion, or worse, criticism for not being a more palatable, upbeat survivor. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The notifications were not a trickle, they were a deluge. Thousands of them. The post, meant as a private catharsis whispered into the void, had been heard. Really heard. But it wasn't the sheer number that made her eyes swim with tears, it was the content. The top comment, with tens of thousands of likes, was from a stranger. Today is my first day of radiation. I've never been more terrified. Reading this, I feel less alone. Thank you for saying what I can't. Beneath it, a tapestry of human experience unfolded. A mother wrote, "My treatment ended 5 years ago. I still have these days. You put my heart into words." A young man shared, "My dad is a survivor. I never understood why he seemed sad sometimes. Now I think I'm starting to." Stories poured in not just from cancer survivors, but from people grieving lost loved ones, from those battling invisible illnesses like depression or chronic pain, from anyone who had ever been told to just get over it while carrying an invisible weight. Catherine sat on her kitchen floor, phone in hand, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't grief or self-pity this time. It was a profound, humbling sense of connection. Her moment of deepest loneliness had become a gathering place. The likes weren't for a pretty picture. They were a silent, digital nod of understanding. People were sharing their own brave, messy truths in her comments, creating a sanctuary of shared vulnerability. This was not the inspiration porn she'd grown to resent. This was real, mutual recognition. For the first time since her diagnosis, the isolating shell around her cracked. She was not an anomaly. She was part of a vast, silent community that had been waiting for someone to give them permission to speak. The momentum was organic and powerful. A major cancer support organization contacted her, asking if they could share her post with their global community. A well-respected oncologist commented, thanking her for articulating the patient experience in a way the medical community needed to hear. News outlets, which had previously only covered her battle, now wanted to talk about her message on life after the battle. But Catherine was cautious. She didn't want to become a talking head, her raw words polished into a soundbite. She remembered the feeling of being a subject, not a person. So, she made a decision. She would speak, but on her own terms. She agreed to an interview, but only if it was a long-form, written piece where she could control her narrative. She started a simple blog, not about cancer, but about relearning life. She wrote about small, tangible things, the exhaustion of a grocery trip, the joy of tasting food again, the complicated emotion of buying a new wig, the anxiety before a follow-up scan. Her audience grew, but the conversation deepened. She began to use her journalistic skills not to report on others, but to facilitate a broader discussion. She invited other survivors of cancer, of trauma, of loss, to share their stories in guest posts. She connected with therapists who specialized in post-traumatic growth and psychiatrists who discussed the neuroscience of trauma, translating their insights into simple, accessible language. Her platform became a bridge between the raw, human experience of suffering and the clinical understanding of it. She never positioned herself as an expert, only as a fellow traveler with a megaphone, asking the questions her community wanted answered. The brave message was no longer a single post. It was an ongoing, evolving conversation. It was about giving language to the wordless, and in doing so, making it less terrifying. Catherine found a new purpose, not in being an inspiration, but in being a translator for the complex, often contradictory language of survival. As the digital community around her flourished, Catherine's private life began a slower, more arduous reconstruction. The public validation was one thing. Facing the empty silence of her own apartment was another. The applause of thousands online could not silence the quiet voice of anxiety that still whispered before every doctor's appointment. She decided that if she was going to talk honestly about life after cancer, she had to live it. This meant confronting the physical and emotional remnants of her illness head-on. She started with her body, a source of both betrayal and resilience. Instead of hiding her scars, she began to trace their stories. The long, smooth line from her surgery, a map of what was taken and what remained. The tiny pinprick scars from ports and IVs, constellations of past battles. She enrolled in a gentle yoga class for survivors. The first session was humbling. Where she once was strong and flexible, she now trembled in simple poses. But in that room, surrounded by others who moved with similar caution, there was no judgment, only collective breath. She learned to listen to her body's new language, not as an enemy, but as a partner who had been through a crisis. She cut her short, chemo-regrown hair into a style she liked, not one meant to look like her old hair. She bought clothes that fit her new shape and felt soft against her sensitive skin, prioritizing comfort over style for the first time. The emotional landscape was trickier. She found a therapist who specialized in trauma and survivorship. In that safe room, she unpacked the baggage she'd been carrying, the anger at her own body, the resentment towards friends who had disappeared, the survivor's guilt she felt when thinking of those she'd met in treatment who hadn't made it. She began to understand that the anxiety she felt wasn't a personal failing. It was a physiological imprint of extreme fear. Her nervous system had been on high alert for over a year. Learning to calm, it was a skill like learning to walk again. She practiced mindfulness, not as a magical cure, but as a tool to anchor herself when the waves of fear threatened to pull her under. She started writing a private journal, separate from her public blog. In it, she allowed herself to be ungrateful, angry, and deeply sad. She gave herself permission to not be okay. She also began the delicate work of rebuilding relationships. She reached out to a few close friends she had pulled away from during her treatment. Over awkward, honest coffees, she explained, "I wasn't pushing you away. I was just drowning, and I didn't know how to ask for a life raft." To her surprise, they listened, and many confessed they had been afraid of saying the wrong thing, so they said nothing at all. These conversations repaired fractured bonds, making them stronger and more authentic. She even went on a few tentative dates, something that had felt impossible before. The first time she told a man about her cancer history, her heart hammered against her ribs. His calm, accepting response was a revelation. It taught her that her history was a part of her, not a defining flaw to be hidden. This personal work began to subtly shape her public message. Her writing became more nuanced. She shared small victories, completing a yoga pose, having a difficult conversation, enjoying a day without thinking about illness. She also shared setbacks, a panic attack before a scan, a day overwhelmed by fatigue and sadness. This balance made her all the more relatable. She was modeling not a perfect recovery, but an authentic one. Followers saw that healing was nonlinear, a spiral rather than a straight line. They saw her stumble, and in her honest reflection on those stumbles, they found permission to forgive their own. Catherine was no longer just sharing her story. She was documenting the active, conscious, and often messy work of rebuilding a life, brick by emotional brick. The world, which had once only seen the fight, was now witnessing the long, quiet, and courageous work of the repair. Catherine's story, now a detailed tapestry of vulnerability and grit, began to ripple far beyond the confines of support groups and personal blogs. The major interview she gave was published by a prestigious international magazine. The headline read, "The Truths We Carry, Catherine Vale on the Lonely Courage of Life After Survival." The article was unflinching, weaving her personal narrative with data on the long-term psychological needs of survivors, which were often neglected by healthcare systems focused solely on physical cure. It struck a global nerve. Overnight, her inbox was flooded with messages from across oceans. A woman in Japan wrote about the cultural pressure to suffer in silence. A man in Brazil shared how his employer could not understand his ongoing fatigue. Doctors from Europe and North America messaged her, asking for resources to better support their patients' emotional journeys. This was the moment her personal mission collided with a global need. She was invited to speak at a major global oncology conference. Standing at the podium, facing an audience of the world's leading cancer specialists, she felt a familiar tremor. But this time it was not from weakness. It was from the weight of the stories she carried. Not just her own, but the thousands entrusted to her. She did not present a scientific paper. She told stories. She read anonymous excerpts from comments and messages, the fear, the isolation, the struggle with identity. She described the cliff patients are pushed off when active treatment ends. "You send us out of the hospital door with a congratulations and a follow-up appointment," she said, her voice clear and steady in the hushed hall. "But you are sending us into an emotional wilderness without a map. The body may be in remission, but the mind is often still at war." The response was a profound, respectful silence, followed by a standing ovation. It was a catalyst. Discussions about mandatory psychosocial support and survivorship care plans moved from the periphery to the center of the agenda. Back home, Catherine, with a small team of volunteers she had met through her community, decided to channel this energy into something tangible. They created the Map Forward, a nonprofit initiative. Its first project was a digital toolkit co-created with healthcare professionals and survivors. It contained practical guides, questions to ask your doctor at follow-ups, mindfulness exercises for skin anxiety, tips for communicating with family about your needs, resources for financial toxicity caused by medical bills. It was not medical advice. It was life advice for the post-treatment landscape. They translated it into a dozen languages within the first 6 months. The second project was a global, virtual Survivor Summit, a free online event featuring experts, storytelling sessions, and peer-led support groups. Hundreds of thousands logged on from every time zone, a visible testament to the vast, interconnected community that existed in the shadows. Catherine's life was now a whirlwind, but it was a whirlwind of purpose. Yet, with this growth came new complexities. The sheer volume of heartbreaking stories shared with her was emotionally taxing. She had to learn to set boundaries, to understand that she could not carry everyone's pain, only help them find their own strength. There were also critics. Some in the old-school, positive thinking camp accused her of dwelling in the negative. A few tabloids tried to paint her as ungrateful for her survival. These stings hurt, but they no longer destabilized her. She had built her foundation on the solid ground of her truth and the real-world impact she saw. She responded with calm clarity. Pretending everything is fine doesn't help anyone heal. Acknowledging the cracks is how the light gets in and how we find each other. Her resilience in the face of this criticism only strengthened her community's devotion. They saw she was the real deal, advocating not for a cause, but for a people she was proudly, irrevocably a part of. 5 years after that first tentative post, Catherine stood on the balcony of a rented villa overlooking the Aegean Sea. She was on a writing retreat, finally working on the book her publisher had long asked for. The journey from that lonely room to this sun-drenched cliff was almost incomprehensible. She was no longer just a survivor or a voice. She was a recognized advocate, her work integrated into survivor care protocols in several countries. The Map Forward had grown into a robust organization with staff and global partnerships. Yet, as she looked out at the vast, ancient sea, her thoughts were not on scale or impact. They were on the quiet, profound alchemy that had occurred within her. The woman who once felt fractured had found a new wholeness, not by going back to who she was, but by integrating all she had been through. The cancer chapter was not a standalone horror story in her life's book. It was the brutal, transformative threshold through which she had walked to become someone else. Someone more compassionate, more intentional, and more real. She no longer saw her body as a traitor, but as a resilient companion that had carried her through hell. The scars were not flaws. They were proof of life. The anxiety still visited, but it was a familiar neighbor now, not a menacing stranger. She knew how to sit with it, offer it tea, and watch it leave again. Her relationship with her audience had also matured. It was no longer just about her story holding up a mirror for others. It was a true exchange. She regularly featured community spotlights, handing her platform over to others to share their journeys of surviving other traumas, loss, addiction, violence. She had learned that while the catalysts of pain are different, the language of recovery, grief, fear, resilience, hope is universal. Her platform had become a living library of human endurance. She often received letters that said, "I've never had cancer, but your words helped me through my divorce/my depression/my chronic illness." This was, to her, the greatest success. She had transcended the specific to touch the universal human experience of suffering and the search for meaning in its wake. The book she was writing reflected this evolution. It was not a cancer memoir. It was a field guide to building a life after any kind of devastation. It wove together personal narrative, the collected wisdom of her community, insights from experts, and practical small-step exercises. The title was a simple question that had been her guiding light. And now? It acknowledged the cliff-edge moment after a crisis, offering not a push, but a gentle hand to hold while one found their own footing. As the sun dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Catherine thought of the countless messages that still flowed in daily. A mother starting a support group in her small town. A teenager using a Map Forward guide to talk to his parents about his depression. A doctor changing her clinic's follow-up procedures. This was her brave message, grown legs and wings. It had moved from a pixelated confession on a screen to tangible change in the real world. It had connected invisible dots between millions of souls, making a once-isolating path feel like a well-traveled, though still challenging, road. Catherine Vale's story was no longer just about life after cancer. It was a testament to the power of a single, honest voice to crack open a world of silence. And, in that crack, to discover not just one's own strength, but the healing power of a community built on the unshakable foundation of truth. The light from her lighthouse, first lit in fear, now reached shores she never knew existed, guiding others home to themselves. This response is AI-generated and, for reference purposes only,